All right, so one thing that I wanted to take a few minutes to do is talk a little bit about homeostasis and what we know about it and kind of help connect some of these ideas that we've learned about so far this year. I apologize, this might be lengthy. I don't really know yet. I've sketched out what I want to talk about. I may go into more detail than I planned. It really depends on what strikes me, but I really hope that what it does is jogs your memory, it helps you connect some ideas that we've talked about so you can think about this in a larger perspective. We call that systematic or systematic biology, so we're looking at systems level stuff. So what we're going to do is start with some pretty simple ideas that we talked about early on. We talked about this in our aquaponics unit. We talked about health and diet and reducing diabetes and obesity, and that required that we understood what macromolecules we're putting into our body. So we spent some time talking about content, I remember correctly, in section 3.2 of your red book. And what we're going to do is really focus on eating sugar, which we know has to do with diabetes, which is where I'm going with this. So I'm talking about eating sugar, but that's not the only thing that we eat. So I'm going to add another note over here. We're talking also about lipids and proteins and nucleic acids. So when we talk about all of those things, what we should be noting is that what we're focusing on right now is sugar, but lipids, like fats, can be used in place of sugar for some functions, and proteins as well. And know that we're focusing on different kinds of proteins right now, which are controlled by or folded based on principles that brought them information, which is based on the nucleic acids, like the DNA and the RNAs. And we're getting ready to learn a little bit more about that. So we eat that sugar. It goes down through our digestive system from our mouth to our esophagus to our stomach. Depending on the type of sugar, if we're talking about polysaccharides, those start to get hydrolyzed or digested in our mouths by the amylase, a type of protein, an enzyme that's breaking down that starch, the polysaccharide starch, into the individual monomers, initially into maltose, which is a disaccharide, and then later in the digestive system into the monosaccharide glucose. And again, this is all review, right? I'm just tying together 6.1 on the digestive system with 3.2 and reviewing that. So it goes through our digestive system. I apologize for my handwriting. With this new computer, things are a little different. I have to get used to it. So we've got the digestive system. And as part of the digestive system, it does two things. It digests or breaks things down or hydrolyzes those large molecules. If they're small molecules, it doesn't need to digest them. But the key is that these things need to get absorbed. And this was a very open, loose term. Absorb just means to move things across the membrane or to soak them in, right? So when we absorb things, they can go through any of those forms of transport that we've learned about. So all of the different types of passive transport, and I'm just going to write passive transport, but if I was taking notes, and I hope that you are, I'm nodding my head up and down, you should be taking notes. You should be writing passive transport, but you should also list all the types of passive transport that you know about. So you should write down simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, even osmosis. So some of the water that you consume, which I just wrote macromolecules up at the top there, but you're also consuming, let's eat and drink. So consuming liquids and water. So that's all passively transported into your body at the small intestines, at the villi of the small intestines, but we've also got some active transport. And if you remember, one of the adaptations of the villi, you have to know that there's a high surface area to volume ratio. Remember, they're villi that are these little finger-like projections, but on top of those finger-like projections, there are microvilli, which are even smaller. And that all increases surface area to volume ratio. There's capillaries sitting right inside of the villi, so that things don't have far to diffuse to get into the bloodstream. And there are lots of mitochondria. Lots and lots of mitochondria in the villi, which produce lots of ATP for the active transport of pumping things into the bloodstream. So some of that stuff gets absorbed into the bloodstream, and then ideally, and this is what we learned about later, it's assimilated, or there's assimilation, which is basically the way that it gets used or recombined for lots of different things. So if we're talking about sugar, we're talking, for our bodies, we're talking about sugars that are used for energy or storage. We sometimes store some of the energy. Remember, we will polymerize some of that extra sugar and store it away as glycogen. So I do want to add one little thing here, and I'm going to add a little squiggle here so we know that it's not quite as simple as that. And I'll tell you, none of this is as simple as we're learning. We're learning more and more layers to this onion, learning more and more of the complexity that's involved. So we're going to add something here. So it's absorbed, but it has to be regulated. Oops, that's supposed to be a straight line. It's supposed to be regulated by homeostasis. If you remember what homeostasis is, this is one of the characteristics of all living things. So in a list that you need to know from section 2.1, I believe, on cells, all living things maintain homeostasis, or some kind of balance. May not be equilibrium, but some kind of balance, right? And they're able to, all living things are able to regulate that balance. So that homeostasis that we've learned about so far, as far as sugar goes, has to do with insulin, right? Insulin and glucagon. So insulin is made by the beta cells of the pancreas. Now, if you remember, the pancreas is also part of the digestive system. The pancreas, as far as the digestive system is concerned, as far as digestion goes, the pancreas has this tube, or a duct, that squeezes pancreatic lipase into the small intestine to help break down some of the lipids, so that they can then be absorbed to the small intestines, into the lacteals and the villus. But the pancreas has a secondary function, and that's to help blood glucose homeostasis. So insulin's used, is made by a type of cell in the pancreas called the beta cells. These beta cells produce the insulin when there's too much blood sugar. And you learned in the video from the homework assignment that insulin interacts with an insulin receptor in certain cells in your body, namely your liver cell. Some of you wrote the word hepatocytes. These are the liver cells, or other muscle cells. And that extra glucose that was digested and then absorbed as the monosaccharide at the small intestines through the villi, if it's high, if there's too much, let's say immediately after a meal, you have a lot of glucose in your system, that insulin goes to work. It's released by the beta cells in the pancreas into the bloodstream. It interacts with these insulin receptors on the cells, on the muscle cells and the liver cells. It causes a reaction for vesicles that are coming from the cells, those cells' Golgi bodies, to send another kind of protein called a GLUT, G-L-U-T. These GLUT proteins help transport that extra glucose. Remember, glucose is a large molecule. It can't just slip right through the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. It's got to go through a protein. So it's a facilitated transport. So that GLUT protein goes through the exocytosis from the cell via vesicle, fuses with the cell membrane, and the glucose outside of the cell transports through that membrane into the cell, and therefore lowers the blood sugar level, and then can be used by those cells. But sometimes it gets stored away as glycogen, and that glycogen, so it's been assimilated, it's recombined, but if your blood sugar is low, that glucagon is going to hydrolyze the glycogen back into glucose, maintaining that homeostasis. So it goes back and forth, right? So one of these uses, oh, and by the way, when that glycogen reserve gets full and you keep eating lots and lots of sugar, your body doesn't know what to do with it because it can't use it immediately. It can't store it in these glycogen reserves in your liver or your muscles. So then it starts to convert that into fat for long-term storage. But one of the uses of that sugar is ATP production. ATP production. And remember, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and that's something that you need to know. But this is the key. One of the other things, besides homeostasis, one of the other things that all living things have to be able to do is use energy. And the form of energy, that currency of energy, is adenosine triphosphate, that ATP. So that ATP, if you remember, is made through cellular respiration. So I know that you're probably thinking, when are we going to be done with cellular respiration? And really we're not, because that is one of the key processes that keeps us alive. So we'll keep hitting that back again and again and again. So if you remember that cellular respiration, and I didn't add that label because you can do that yourself, starts with glycolysis. So once the glucose that you've eaten, that sugar, the monosaccharides, have been absorbed into your cells, let's say insulin is one way that happens, it gets into your cells, into the cytoplasm, and that's where the glucose gets broken down into the 2 pyruvates. Then it will go into Krebs, if it's aerobic, right? If there's oxygen available, it goes to Krebs, the Krebs cycle, where the NADH and the FADH2 are made. CO2 comes off, which we'll come back to in just a second, and the NADH and the FADH2s, with those hydrogens, move to the electron transport chain, which is really where most of the ATP is made, and that's what's going to fuel the rest of your survival, right? So we've got glucose that we're using, that we've consumed. That carbon, the glucose, remember, glucose is C6H12O6. The carbons there are then given off here as carbon dioxide. Some of the oxygen comes off here, and the hydrogens are what's going to be key between the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So we've got glucose coming into glycolysis, but we haven't talked about oxygen, the other major reactant for aerobic cellular respiration. And so let's work backwards there. So how does oxygen, we use a different color here, how does oxygen, so oxygen, if you remember, oxygen is involved in the electron transport chain. It combines with the hydrogens, that was this symbol right here, to give off that water. But where does that oxygen come from? We're talking about the mitochondria, right? The oxygen is involved in the mitochondria. And so how does that oxygen get there? Well, the oxygen has to diffuse into the mitochondria from the cells, right? So oxygen is so small, it's nonpolar, it can fit between the phospholipid bilayer. That oxygen diffuses into the cell, into the mitochondria, so it's diffusing from, let's say, from red blood cells into another body cell, which then diffuses into the mitochondria to be used by the electron transport chain. Okay, so it diffuses into the red blood cells, and if you remember, these red blood cells, there are 2 types, right? There are 2 types that we've learned about recently. So the 2 types, the quote-unquote normal and the sickle cell, right? So there are actually other kinds as well. So if you want to know, ask about fetal hemoglobin. But we've got these 2. We've got red blood cells that have normal hemoglobin and red blood cells that have sickle cell hemoglobin, or sickle cell red blood cells because of the mutated hemoglobin. Sorry about that. I wanted to rephrase that and clarify. So diffusing the red blood cells. But how did it get to the red blood cells? Well, it diffused across the alveoli, from the alveoli of the lungs into the red blood cells, because and so I'm going to put a big star here because you need to know the adaptations of the alveoli that allow for this diffusion to happen so quickly, which has to do with a couple of similar ideas with the villi. Surface area to volume ratio has to do with moisture of the alveoli. There's some mucus that's involved with our cystic fibrosis protein. So I hope you see how insulin is actually connected to this in a roundabout way. alveoli also are surrounded by capillaries, or which is your bloodstream that's carrying these red blood cells that will carry the oxygen. So, anyways, we've got the alveoli, which are connected to, and I'm just going to call this the respiratory, as part of the respiratory system. But you need to know the parts like the bronchioles, the bronchi, the trachea, the diaphragm, and all of that. The respiratory system, what's involved here is the ventilation, and really it's all about oxygen, right? It's all about oxygen. So getting oxygen out. But the other thing is that CO2 works in the opposite way through that same pathway, just with an opposite concentration gradient. Okay? So I think that's kind of, let me zoom out a little bit. Let me see if I can do that. Yep. All right, so here is what we're looking at of how this is all kind of related. And I hope that you realize there are actually far more connections. And I didn't write a whole lot down. I talked a lot more. I realized that I've been talking for about 16 minutes. And I've been going real fast. So I think I'm going to stop there. But what I encourage you to do is think through this. See if you can tell that same story to somebody else who has no idea of what's going on. So what I really mean is someone who's not a biology student. Try talking to your mom or dad about this and see if you can explain that. And write down questions that they have and that you have about this process so that that can be fodder for conversation in class, okay? I hope that this makes some sense to you. Really what we've been talking about in greater detail more recently is this passive transport idea. We're talking about homeostasis and insulin. Oh, I didn't mention glucagon, but I hope you understand that glucagon is used in low blood sugar. It's made by alpha cells in the pancreas. And so only when the blood sugar comes below the homeostatic level, that normal balance level, is glucagon released to hydrolyze that glycogen that's been stored as a reserve back into glucose, releasing into the bloodstream, maintaining that homeostasis. An analogy to this would be like when you get really hot, like instead of homeostatic blood sugar levels, we can talk about like your body temperature, right? You know your body temperature is supposed to be 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If you get too hot, your body sweats to cool it down. If you get too cold, your body shivers, which is actually meant to increase your ATP production so that you're making more ATP, but as a byproduct of that, remember that heat is produced, and that's meant to warm you up. So that's, make sure you understand that. We spoke specifically about diabetes, which is problems in insulin production, which has major problems in homeostasis, and then causes some of the other symptoms like high blood sugar, high blood pressure, because when you have high blood sugar and insulin's not able to downregulate that blood sugar, you have more solutes in your blood, water rushes in through that osmosis, and increases the volume of things inside of your blood vessels, which increases the pressure, causing high blood pressure. You'll also feel more tired because you actually don't get that sugar out of your bloodstream to be used to make ATP. Instead, you're consuming a lot of sugar, but it's not being used, and therefore you're tired. You're also probably hungrier. And so one of the things we talked about with the aquaponic system was how that goal of the aquaponic system was to reduce obesity and diabetes. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure that you don't have lots of really sugary or fatty foods staying in your digestive system for longer periods of time to continuously be absorbed. And one way to do that is to flush it out. Remember, with cellulose or fiber, things that we cannot digest, that would continue to push things through so that they will not stay in the small intestines or large intestines even for longer periods of time to be absorbed, increasing the sugar levels and the fat levels in your blood, which would, if you're type 1 diabetic, be a huge problem. If you're not yet a type 2 diabetic, it's going to continue to wear out your insulin receptors, which can cause type 2 diabetes. And we used to call that adult onset. diabetes, but now we call it, or it's becoming referred to as child onset. We have more and more children being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and part of that might be diet related, and part of that is not being as active, because activity is going to help your muscle movement is going to help push food through your system instead of keeping it locked, kind of stuck in your small and large intestines. Okay, I think I've talked for an additional 4 minutes now, so I'm going to stop here.